Everyone thinks they know what a harem was. A room full of beautiful women lounging around in silk, waiting for the Sultan's attention, exotic, sensual, maybe a little scandalous, but ultimately romantic. Hollywood sold you that image. Orientalist paintings reinforced it. The word harem itself conjures fantasies of pleasure and indulgence. But the reality of the Ottoman imperial harem was nothing like that fantasy. It wasn't a pleasure palace. It was a maximum security, political institution where women fought wars without armies, destroyed rivals without weapons, and shaped an empire from behind locked doors. And the body count was very, very real. If dark history that shatters comfortable myths is your thing, subscribe to I'm Disturbed Historian for more. We're telling the stories that don't fit the fantasy. The imperial harem at Topkapi Palace wasn't just where the Sultan kept his women. It was the most restricted, heavily guarded section of the entire palace complex. High walls, locked gates, eunuch guards who'd been castrated specifically to serve there. No man with functioning genitals, aside from the Sultan and young princes, was permitted inside. But that security wasn't to protect virtue, it was to contain power. Because the women inside the harem controlled succession, they determined which prince would become the next sultan. And in the Ottoman system, controlling succession meant controlling the empire. Here's what actually happened inside. The harem housed hundreds of women. Not all of them were the sultan's concubines. Most weren't. The majority were servants, slaves, attendants, girls taken from conquered territories or purchased from slave markets. Circassian, Georgian, Greek, Slavic, Jewish, African, the Ottomans didn't discriminate by ethnicity. Beauty and potential were the only currencies that mattered. These girls entered the harem as children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6. They were torn from their families and brought to the palace. There was no choice involved, no romance. They were property. Upon arrival, they were given new names, Turkish names. Their pasts were erased. They were converted to Islam if they weren't already Muslim. They were trained, educated, taught Turkish, Persian, Arabic, taught music, embroidery, poetry, dance, taught how to move, how to speak, how to serve. The training lasted years. It was rigorous. It was designed to transform foreign slaves into Ottoman ladies. And it worked. The best students, the most beautiful or talented, might catch the Sultan's eye, might. There was no guarantee. Most women in the harem never spoke to the Sultan, never even saw him up close. They lived their entire lives in service, grew old, and died without ever fulfilling the purpose they'd been trained for. But the few who did attract the Sultan's attention entered a different game entirely. If the Sultan slept with you, you became a concubine. If you bore him a son, you became something far more valuable. A potential Valide Sultan, the mother of the future emperor. And that's where the real war began. Ottoman succession didn't follow primogeniture. The throne didn't automatically go to the eldest son. Any son could potentially become sultan, which meant every mother in the harem had a motive to ensure her son rose to power. Because if your son became sultan, you became the most powerful woman in the empire. You controlled access to the sultan. You influenced policy. You dispensed patronage. You were untouchable. But if a rival's son took the throne, your son was dead, and probably you too. So the harem became a battlefield. Not of swords, but of poison. Manipulation, alliance, and betrayal. Mothers schemed against mothers. They bribed eunuchs for information. They formed factions. They spread rumors about rival sons. They sabotaged each other's reputations. And when scheming wasn't enough, they killed. Poison was common, easily disguised. A concubine would fall ill, fever, vomiting, convulsions, death. The physicians would attribute it to natural causes. Everyone in the harem knew better. But proving poison was nearly impossible, and accusing someone without proof was dangerous. So women died, and their rivals advanced. And the cycle continued. Infanticide happened too. If you could eliminate a rival's son before he grew old enough to matter, you removed a future threat. Infant mortality in the harem was suspiciously high. Some babies genuinely died from disease, but others were smothered, or given contaminated milk, or simply disappeared. The records are vague. Deliberately vague. The Ottoman court didn't advertise these things. The most successful harem women were the ones who understood that power wasn't about beauty or sex. It was about intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. They built networks. They cultivated relationships with powerful men outside the harem. Viziers, military commanders, religious leaders. They positioned their sons for success long before succession became an issue. They played a game that lasted decades. And they played it perfectly or they lost everything. Roxalana is the most famous example. She started as a slave, captured in a raid, possibly from what's now Ukraine, brought to the harem as a girl. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty was common in the harem. What set Roxalana apart was her mind. She understood how the system worked. She made herself indispensable to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, not just as a concubine, but as a confidant. She converted him from the traditional Ottoman practice of keeping concubines to something unheard of, monogamy. Suleiman broke centuries of tradition and married. Her married. Ottoman sultans didn't marry. They kept concubines to avoid binding political alliances through marriage. But Roxalana convinced Suleiman to make her his legal wife. That gave her a status no concubine had ever held. It gave her legitimacy, and it gave her sons a massive advantage in the succession struggle. But Roxalana had a problem. Suleiman already had an older son, Mustafa, from a previous concubine. Mustafa was popular, competent, beloved by the military. If Suleiman died, Mustafa would almost certainly become sultan. And if Mustafa became sultan, Roxalana's sons would be executed. That was the system. New sultan, dead rivals. Roxalana couldn't allow that, so she destroyed Mustafa. Not directly. She was too smart for that. She planted seeds of doubt, whispered to Suleiman that Mustafa was gathering support, that the military loved him too much, that he might not wait for his father to die before taking power. She worked on Suleiman's paranoia slowly, carefully, over years, and eventually Suleiman believed her. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent during a military campaign. Mustafa came trusting his father. When he entered, executioners were waiting. They strangled him with a bowstring while Suleiman watched. Mustafa was innocent. He'd done nothing wrong. But Roxalana had convinced Suleiman otherwise. And in the Ottoman system, the Sultan's word was absolute. With Mustafa dead, Roxalana's sons were safe. One of them, Selim, eventually became Sultan. He was known as Selim the Drunkard. He was incompetent. He spent his reign drinking and left governance to his advisors. But he was Sultan, and Roxalana, had she lived to see it, would have been Valide Sultan. She died before Suleiman, so she never held the title officially, but she'd won. She'd taken a system designed to keep women powerless and weaponized it. She'd gone from slave to the most influential woman in the empire. And she'd done it by orchestrating the murder of an innocent man. That's what the harem actually was, a place where women like Roxalana fought for survival using the only tools available. To them, intelligence, manipulation, murder, The role of Valide Sultan was formalized because of women like Roxalana. By the late 16th century, it was understood that the mother of the Sultan held immense power. She lived in her own apartments within the harem. She controlled a massive budget. She had her own staff. She met with foreign ambassadors. She influenced appointments. In many cases, she effectively ran the empire while her son sat on the throne. Some Valide sultans were more powerful than the sultans themselves. Ottoman Sultan is the prime example. She was a concubine who bore Sultan Ahmed I a son. When Ahmed died young, her son Murad IV eventually became sultan. Ottoman served as Valide Sultan during his reign. When Murad died, her other son Ibrahim became sultan. Ottoman served as Valide Sultan again. She held power for decades. She survived multiple sultans. She controlled the empire through sheer political genius, but Ottoman made enemies. She clashed with her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, who was the mother of the young Sultan Mehmed IV, two Valide sultans in the same harem, both vying for control, both commanding factions. The tension was unsustainable. In 1651, Turhan made her move. She sent assassins into Ottoman's apartments. They found the elderly Valide Sultan and strangled her with a curtain. Ottoman Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, died violently at the hands of her rival. Turhan took control. She became the dominant Valide Sultan, and the empire moved on, because in the harem this was normal. This was how power transferred. The eunuchs who guarded the harem were integral to these power struggles. They weren't just guards. They were information brokers, political players. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Aga, was one of the most powerful officials in the empire. He controlled access to the harem. He managed the harem's finances. He knew every secret, every affair, every plot. And he used that knowledge to accumulate wealth and influence. Eunuchs were castrated boys, usually taken as slaves from Africa or the Caucasus. The castration was brutal. Most didn't survive the procedure. Those who did grew up serving the palace. They couldn't have families, couldn't have sexual relationships. Their entire existence was tied to the institution. So they became fanatically loyal, not to individuals but to the system itself. And they played all sides. A smart concubine cultivated relationships with eunuchs, bribed them, flattered them, used them to spy on rivals. The eunuchs in turn sold information to the highest bidder. They facilitated secret communications. They delivered poison. They warned their favorites about plots. They were kingmakers, or rather sultan makers. The harem had rules, but the rules were flexible if you had power. Lower-ranking concubines lived in dormitories, shared rooms, communal meals, strict supervision. They had almost no freedom. But high-ranking concubines, especially those who'd borne sons, lived in private apartments. They had servants. They entertained guests within limits. They wielded influence. Still, everyone was trapped. The harem was luxurious, but it was still a prison. High walls, locked doors. You couldn't leave without permission, and permission was rarely granted. Women spent entire lifetimes inside those walls. Some entered as children and died as old women, without ever stepping outside the harem complex. The psychological toll was immense. You lived in constant competition. Everyone around you was a potential rival. Every friendship was strategic. Every conversation could be a trap. You couldn't trust anyone completely. Paranoia was rational. Women went mad, some from isolation, some from stress, some from the sheer weight of spending decades in a beautiful cage. Suicide wasn't uncommon. Women threw themselves from windows, poisoned themselves, drowned in the baths. The official records rarely mentioned these deaths. When they did, it was always oblique. She passed from melancholy. She succumbed to illness. The harem protected its secrets even in death. And then there were the women who aged out. If you didn't bear a son, if you lost the sultan's favor, you became irrelevant. You were moved to older sections of the harem, given less attention, fewer resources. You lived out your days as a ghost, watching younger women play the game you'd lost. Some were eventually freed and married off to low-ranking officials. A pension, a small house. Freedom, technically, but you'd spent your entire life in the palace. You knew no other world. Freedom was just a different kind of prison. The women who did bear sons faced a different horror. You raised your child knowing that his future was binary. He'd either become sultan or die. There was no middle ground, no quiet retirement. If your son lost the succession struggle, he'd be executed. You'd watch him die or learn about it afterward. And there was nothing you could do except fight harder, scheme better, kill first. Some mothers couldn't handle it. They begged their sons to give up any claim to the throne, to live quietly, to avoid politics. It never worked. The system didn't allow neutrality. If you were a prince, you were a threat, and threats were eliminated. The fratricide law, which we discussed earlier, meant that when a new sultan took power, he'd order his brothers executed. All of them. The mothers of those princes would lose their sons in a single night. Imagine that. You spend 20 years raising a boy, protecting him, fighting for him, and then a different prince becomes sultan, and your son is strangled. You hear him die, maybe, or you're told afterward. Either way, he's gone, and you're still alive, trapped in the harem, surrounded by the women whose sons killed yours. Some of these mothers were pensioned off, sent to the old palace, a separate complex where retired concubines lived. It was comfortable enough, but you spent the rest of your life knowing you'd failed. Your son was dead. Your rival had won, and there was no appeal, no revenge. Just the slow passage of years until you died forgotten. The harem eventually declined in power. By the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire modernized and westernized, the institution became an embarrassment. European powers mocked it. Reformers within the empire pushed for change. The harem's political influence waned. Sultans took fewer concubines. Some took none. The last Ottoman sultan abolished the harem entirely in the early 20th century. The women were freed or pensioned. The buildings were repurposed. Today, parts of the harem at Topkapi Palace are open to tourists, so you can walk through the corridors, see the opulent tile work, the gilded ceilings, the marble fountains. It's beautiful, haunting, but sanitized. The tour guides talk about architecture and art. They mention the concubines briefly. They don't talk about the poison, the infanticide, the political murders, the psychological warfare, the suicide, the children strangled on their mother's orders, because the truth doesn't fit the postcard. The truth is ugly. The truth is that the Ottoman harem was an institution built on slavery, maintained through violence, and powered by women who had no choice but to become monsters or die. There's a tendency to romanticize these women, to see them as feminist icons, women wielding power in a patriarchal society. And yes, some harem women were brilliant strategists who navigated impossible situations. But let's not pretend this was empowerment. It was survival. They didn't choose the system. They were forced into it. And the power they wielded came at a horrific cost. Roxalana orchestrated a son's murder. Kosem was strangled by her rival. Countless mothers watched their children die. Countless women poisoned each other. This wasn't liberation. This was what happens when you trap intelligent, desperate people in a zero-sum game and tell them only one can win. The harem also reveals something uncomfortable about power itself. We like to think power corrupts, that good people in bad systems resist. But the harem shows that systems don't need to corrupt people. They just need to create incentives. If your son's life depends on another child's death, and you love your son, you'll kill that child. Not because you're evil, because you're human, because the system has made murder rational. Every woman in the harem understood this. They weren't naive. They knew the game, and they played it because refusing to play meant losing everything. Your life, your child's life, any hope of security or status. So they smiled at rivals they wanted dead. They befriended women they planned to betray. They did what the system required, and the system ground them down until there was nothing left. But the role they'd been forced to play, the eunuchs understood it too. They'd been mutilated and enslaved. They had no illusions about the empire's benevolence, but they carved out what power they could. They exploited the only leverage available. They played concubines against each other. They enriched themselves through bribes. They survived by being useful, and when they died, other eunuchs replaced them. The institution continued. Even the sultans were trapped in a way. They had absolute power theoretically, but they were surrounded by schemers. Their mothers manipulated them. Their concubines maneuvered for advantage. Their advisors had agendas. The janissaries, the military corps, could depose a sultan they didn't like. So sultans lived in luxury, but also in paranoia. Every meal could be poisoned. Every concubine could be a spy. Every son could be plotting. The harem, which should have been a refuge, was just another battlefield. What's remarkable is how long the system lasted. The harem functioned for over 400 years. Centuries of women cycling through the same power struggles. Centuries of the same patterns: poison, favoritism, murder, succession crises. And yet the empire kept the institution. Because it worked, after a fashion. It produced heirs. It kept women contained. It created a controllable mechanism for succession, even if that mechanism was soaked in blood. But the cost was extraordinary. Not just in lives lost, though that was significant, but in human potential wasted. The women in the harem were often brilliant, educated, talented, strategic, thinkers who could have contributed to society in meaningful ways. Instead, they spent their intelligence destroying each other over access to a man and the future of a son. Their capabilities were channeled into a game that benefited no one except, occasionally, themselves. And the empire suffered for it. Sultans raised in the harem, surrounded by intrigue and violence, often made terrible rulers. They trusted no one. They saw conspiracies everywhere. They ruled through fear because fear was all they'd ever known. The harem produced paranoid, incompetent sultans who accelerated the empire's decline. The institution, designed to ensure stable succession, created instability by traumatizing the very people it elevated. There's no happy ending here. The harem didn't reform itself. It didn't evolve into something better. It just ended. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The harem was abolished. The women were freed into a world many of them didn't understand. And history moved on. What remains is the fantasy, the paintings, the stories. The Hollywood version where women lounge in silk, and everything is vaguely sensual and exotic. That version is easier to consume. It doesn't require confronting the reality that the Ottoman harem was an engine of trauma that destroyed everyone it touched. But the real story is more important than the fantasy, because the harem wasn't unique. Every society that's concentrated power has created similar institutions. Different names, different aesthetics, but the same basic structure. Trap people in a system where violence is rational. Then act surprised when they become violent. The Ottoman Harem was a political war zone where the soldiers were enslaved women and the weapons were poison, manipulation, and infanticide. It was a centuries-long experiment in what happens when you give people no power except the power to destroy each other. And the answer, demonstrated over and over, is that they will. Not because they're evil, but because the system leaves no alternative. The women who succeeded in the harem weren't heroes, they were survivors. And survival in that system required becoming someone most of us would find monstrous. They killed children, they betrayed friends, they orchestrated murders. They did these things not despite being human, but because they were human. Because humans, when trapped and desperate, will do whatever it takes to protect themselves and the people they love. That's the real lesson of the Ottoman Harem. Not that women can be powerful, but that power without freedom is just another form of slavery. That institutions built on violence create violent people. That systems matter more than individuals. That you can trap brilliant people in a beautiful palace and watch them tear each other apart for centuries, and the only thing you'll prove is that beauty and brutality aren't opposites. They're roommates. The fantasy version of the harem is dead. It died the moment you learned what actually happened there. And maybe that's uncomfortable. Maybe it ruins something you enjoyed believing. But discomfort is useful. It means you're learning something true. And the truth, however ugly, is always more valuable than a pretty lie. The Ottoman harem was not a fantasy. It was a machine. A machine that consumed girls and produced either corpses or monsters. And it ran for 400 years because everyone involved, from the sultans to the concubines to the eunuchs to the empire itself, kept feeding it. The machine is gone now. The buildings remain. The stories survive. And somewhere in those stories is a warning we should probably pay attention to. Because the impulse that created the harem, the desire to concentrate power and control people completely, that impulse hasn't disappeared. It just builds different machines.